Dr. Lyndon Lewis, who is on my immediate left, will present on, he's in the Department of Sociology at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Will present on socialist crisis and the trajectory of Caribbean politics. Dr. Addison Coppin, who is on his left, who is at the Department of Economics and Business at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, will present on Caribbean economic integration and the NAFTA. And Rita Giacalone, who is not here at this moment, who should be coming anytime now, we hope, will speak on global restructuring, CARICOM, and political actors of Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. And our discussants this afternoon will be Dr. Winston Griffith, also of Bucknell University Economics Department. He's sitting on my right. And Paul Sussman could not be here, so I am going to participate as one of the discussants of papers presented at this panel as well. Okay. The issues we are looking at in these panels are very important issues in our consideration, and they reflect developments now in motion globally. Rita Giacalone has just arrived. I indicated that Rita would be coming anytime soon. She is with the Universidad de los Andes in Venezuela. And so we're saying these are very important issues. We recognize that there is significant change occurring at the global level. In some respects, at the level of science, technology, and industry, the change is unprecedented and unrelenting. And this morning I said there is a paradigm shift occurring here, and every one of us has some basic idea of what a paradigm is. And we're talking not only about changes in the structure of production and research and development, but we're talking about change that is so deep-seated, so radical, so fundamental as to constitute a break with the past. Also, it requires a change in consciousness, if you will, a paradigm shift in consciousness to grasp and encompass the changes which are occurring. In a basic way, you might say that the issues we are looking at in a modest way are more or less on the cutting edge of global developments. And we understand that when we are attempting to grapple with issues of this scope, magnitude, and intensity, there is a difficulty of being too precise. There is a difficulty of being rigid, because it is necessary that we allow a certain amount of space not only to grasp phenomena in motion, but to understand that when things settle and the dust settles, sometimes they don't look exactly as they looked when all of the dust was flowing around. So we understand this particular necessity. I will not therefore be long in introducing the panel, but to suggest that we think that we're going to have a very excellent panel here this afternoon, and hope that you who are interested in these issues will bear with us through the presentations, and we will definitely allow time for question and answer after. I've indicated, or I'm indicating to the presenters, that they have each 15 minutes to summarize their major arguments, and I will hold them to that, and I will interrupt them if necessary in a very gentle way. But I insist that you, the audience who came here, without you, we don't really have a session. We can have a panel, but not a session. And that you will have an opportunity to participate from the floor, rather than come to the end and say, "Hi, look, we ran out of time, we're sorry, but thank you for coming." That's not good enough. So I'm going to turn to the panelists in the order in which the names appear, and ask Lyndon Lewis to present the essence of his work in 15 minutes.
There's something about being on a panel with HILBOURNE that is always restricting in terms of how much you can say about your paper. This I want you to treat as a work in progress, because that's exactly how I've been treating it. It is something which is still evolving, still being crystallized. And I think that as more is revealed about what exactly this collapse in Eastern Europe is about, that we'll have to make more adjustments about the kind of analysis that we want to make in terms of the Caribbean region. What I want to do in this presentation is to talk about some of the principal causes and perhaps consequences of the socialist collapse in Eastern Europe as a sort of background for discussing some of the implications for politics in general in the Caribbean. It is the intention here to look at the socialist collapse as a part of a wider crisis of socialism, and then to look at the question of the implications to the region in terms of attempting to identify whether or not there was an independent crisis of the left in the Caribbean, which has been exacerbated by the events in Europe, and to make some sort of preliminary statements about the future of politics in the region. Since 1989, when we had the first, or what might be called a renewed sign of resistance within what we are calling now actually existing socialism, and I'm talking here about the situation that the protests that took place in Tiananmen Square in China. Political commentators have been scouring the rest of the world, looking for the impact, the implications, and for explanations for the course of events. And what we can say is that perhaps not since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 itself have there been such sweeping societal changes with such profound global implications. What seems to be generally agreed upon, and there are a number of things that are not agreed upon, is that in many ways a lot of what has happened in Europe has been the result of the reform measures which were implemented by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. Unlike the Bolshevik Revolution, however, the changes that have been taking place in Eastern Europe have for the most part been the result of popular struggles from below. These have been genuine struggles for bread and justice, and for an end to corruption, and for an end to the privilege of the few. In the West, these events have been interpreted as demands for capitalism and the triumph of the market. In addition, the changes have also been seen as not as an end to ideology this time around, but an end to history, and most definitely an end to the Cold War. All of these changes have been taking place at a time when capitalism, rather than dying and declining as a result of the many crises that it too has been experiencing, at a time when the capitalism has in fact been consolidating its control over the world economy. Indeed, we heard some of this discussion this morning at the plenary session. There are some who would argue that the reform measures in the former Soviet Union, which precipitated the changes in Eastern Europe notwithstanding, that the restructuring of the global political economy and socialism's marginal relation to it were in some way influential in determining the fate of the latter. And now I'll give you a sort of overview of events here. Since the advent of this democracy movement, as it is being called, political analysts have been looking for the trends. While some of these trends have been happening simultaneously, there is no doubt that some of them have been forced by multilateral institutions in the West, in terms of bringing pressure, mostly from the United States, to fall in line with some of the changes that have been taking place. The latter development aside, these changes have been taking place, the changes that have been taking place in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe have some serious ramifications for many countries, including some of the African countries, and the ones that are certainly in the limelight at this point are places like Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, Kenya, Zaire, and Benin. And I think that Loxley Edmondson this morning pointed out the extent to which it would be somewhat superficial to suggest that those changes that have been taking place in Africa are a direct result of what happened in Europe. What we do know is that these democratic traditions have in fact existed for some time, and what we can certainly attribute to what has happened in Eastern Europe is that it has provided a sort of environment within which such democratic resistance can in fact flourish. In the Caribbean, since there are currently no existing socialist governments except Cuba, the democracy movement has served to further marginalize the left, perhaps in some cases into oblivion. At another level, the democracy movement has also tended to put democratic governments in the region on the defensive. The latter development is best seen in the case of Guyana, where the climate, I believe, is now more favorable than it has ever been for free and fair elections in that country. Before addressing some of the more specific changes that I'm thinking about in terms of what has been happening in Eastern Europe and the implications to the Caribbean, I'd just like to look at some of the issues that have been emerging in the case of Europe itself. We know, for example, of the coming to office of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, and from all accounts, it seems as though he was inheriting a stagnant economy with a bloated bureaucracy. We know that in terms of the economy, that there was a decline in the production of coal, steel, machine tools, oil, paper, cement, and cars. In fact, Gorbachev himself identified some of the problems at a plenum of the Central Committee in 1985, and he says that some of the issues in terms of the problems that the Soviet Union faced revolve around the issue of technological backwardness, the low quality of many industrial products, the low return on generally excessive and unfinished or frozen investments, unbalanced planning, and chronic wastage of energy and raw materials. Some people have described this as the legacy of 18 years of Leonid Brezhnev and of neo-Stalinist conservatism. I think that many of you are familiar with the reforms that have been implemented by Gorbachev. I'll just briefly identify the strategies. There was the first one was perestroika, or economic restructuring. Part 2 dealt with openness and was described as glasnost, and part 3 was the democratization process. The perestroika was an attempt to deal with the economic problems, while the glasnost was intended to respond to the political crisis that was taking hold of the Soviet Union. There are just a couple of things that I want to mention briefly because of the constraint of time, and already the moderator is tearing paper to pass over, and that is that there's a sense in which Gorbachev himself talks about what was happening in the Soviet Union and his response to it in a very personal kind of way. If I may quote him a minute, he says, "If I had not inwardly reached the conclusion that things had to be changed, I would have worked and ruled as they did before me, like Brezhnev. 10 years of living like an emperor, and what if the grass then stops growing?" And I think that there's a sense in which he gives you some indication of his personal commitment to change. But I'm suggesting that it was not just a personal reflection on what was happening, that there were objective conditions operating in the Soviet Union which would have forced him into some of these changes. There's a sense in which the economy, as one Soviet commentator was suggesting, Kagarlitsky, was suggesting that the economy began to decentralize itself spontaneously, and it became unmanageable and ungovernable from the center. there's also a sense in which I think Gorbachev opened up a can of worms, the direction of which he had no control over and could not anticipate the likely consequences of his action. And there's a sense also in which some of the reforms that were started in the Soviet Union were seized upon by other parts of the socialist bloc and pushed even further for greater reforms. With respect to the collapse specifically, both the left and the right seem to be uninhibited about pronouncing the death of socialism. For example, Margaret Thatcher proclaimed the decade of the 80s as the failure of socialism. And Martin Jacques, the editor of Marxism Today, declared that the international communist movement was certainly at an end. And Fred Halliday, who writes a lot about the end of the Cold War and so on, was quoted as saying, "This means nothing less than the defeat of the communist project as it has been known to us in the 20th century, and the triumph of the capitalist." And there are a number of people who, on one side of the fence or the other, talk about the death of socialism. The other thing that emerges is that there are people, there's another school of thought which says what has died in the Soviet Union is not socialism, but some deformation, some diversion, some digression from the ideal model of socialism. I think that Ralph Miliband articulated this position very clearly, and I like to quote his comment on it. He says, "Now whatever else may be said about it, it cannot be said that the model has anything to do with socialism, for it contravenes fundamentally the defining features of the socialist project. It is an exceedingly undemocratic form of rule. It concentrates extreme power in the hands of relatively few people. It solidifies and strengthens bureaucracy and grants great privileges to it. It sacrifices individual rights to what the leaders declare to be social requirements, and this is quite often arbitrary," and he goes on. I think that what is important to bear in mind is that a number of things coalesced to result in the breakdown of the socialist system. Clearly, the internal problems of economic stagnation, the political, social, and moral crisis all contributed to it. And in addition, there was this moral question that Shannon raises. In the final analysis, however, I think one may choose to characterize the experiment which was carried out in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, it was articulated to be, and by all accounts seemed to have been, qualitatively different from that of capitalism. Whether it was authentic or not may be theoretically engaging in its own right. However, the fact of the matter remains that whatever that system was, it has now run its course and will never be allowed to reconstitute itself in its old form. And I think that the other crucial question that we need to bear in mind is not whether, I don't think we should be hung up over whether or not what was happening, the experiment was socialist, but to find out, in fact, whatever it is, how it has been able to reproduce itself for such a long period of time. And if we begin to ask ourselves, how has this system been able to reproduce itself, I think we get to the heart of the matter of the tremendous amount of repression that was necessary to maintain a system like that in its place. Okay, so let me. Okay, if we could make this really big leap here into the Caribbean, and for the purposes of this presentation, Caribbean here I'm defining in terms of the English-speaking region of the English-speaking countries of the region, because I think that Cuba is a very special case which requires a kind of analysis which cannot be comfortably put in place in this paper, and which stands in marked contrast to the other islands of the Caribbean. The events which changed the political complexion of Eastern Europe have profound implications for the Caribbean in general. Those people to the right have welcomed the changes. They have tended to point their fingers to the left, implying that the socialist collapse should serve as a warning to the latter to abandon their political philosophies. The right has also tended to behave as though there's nothing in this collapse of a system from which they can learn. And I think that what is missing in this view from the right is that the collapse is not necessarily or not exclusively a call for the embracement of capitalism, but a demand for democratization and for participation. And on the strengths of such demands alone, the lessons from the former Soviet Union and the socialist bloc in general are of particular interest to the right, which has for years fostered a tradition of authoritarianism in the region. The Caribbean right will begin to find it increasingly harder to govern in the way in which it has done in the past. The call for inclusion is a grassroots call, which is currently manifesting itself in terms of the growing popularity and importance of non-governmental organizations in the region. Participation from below requires consultation with the mass of the people more often than once every 5 years. In addition, the new wave of democracy has already begun to mean taking questions of accountability more seriously. And I think that if we look at the cases of Guyana and of Barbados as in the throes of its present crisis, and also in the case of Antigua, we will see that the question of accountability is becoming much more salient, and will do so, and will continue to do so in the near future. I think also that there's a sense in which those on the right look at the collapse of the Soviet Union and see it as an end to the irritation of people from the left, because they now see it as a situation in which those who adhere to leftist policies are no longer with any validity or credibility. So I think that the question of accountability, both economic and political accountability, will become important. While those on the right may have some difficulty recognizing the relevance of this crisis to their particular situation, I think that those on the left are without any doubt about what has happened. The crisis of socialism has served to further confound the Caribbean left. And when we talk about the Caribbean left, we're talking about a fairly small group of people who have existed in various territories in the Caribbean, but who have never actually engaged the popular consciousness to the point that it presented a real threat and viable alternative to what the Caribbean has been accustomed to. Now, my argument here is that in terms of the Caribbean, that the left has had a crisis of its own, which I think we can talk about even from the point of view of the 1953 the PPP in 1953, after it was able to come to office legitimately with an election. Then it was sabotaged by all kinds of imperialist forces. And I think that the left in the Caribbean has never really recovered from that particular crisis. I think also the fact that the left has not been able to expand and to become a force to be reckoned with in terms of wide popularity and embracement of that particular philosophy suggests in some ways its own crisis as well. Their organizational crises, crises of authoritarianism that we know of in a number of the political parties to the left, that I think in some way to address this question of the independence of the left. And as I said in relation to Africa, that a number of these crises have been exacerbated by the crisis in the Soviet Union. I think that the response so far has been either of the left to this crisis, if I could just very quickly summarize the last few pages there, is either to essentially become moribund, which a number of leftist parties have become, or to make some adjustments, however reluctantly, to what has been going on. And a number of them, a number of political parties on the left in the Caribbean have been going through this period of self-examination and restructuring. And I think that somewhere in there holds the potential for the future of the Caribbean in terms of what kind of democratic political process these parties are going to eventually emerge with, if they do emerge. And I think that the entire process of restructuring in Eastern Europe has been one of self-examination, which can only serve for the better of politics, for socialism, for those of us who still believe in it, and for the region as a whole. Thank you.